my timer's going, is a tartan rather than a plain cloth. I'll explain that a bit in a moment. So I'm going to be talking about building a shared workflow across the life cycle of a digital collection to preserve what's called the Regional Ethnology of Scotland Project Archive. And the title of my talk comes from an interview with Robert McQuiston, who's from Creetown, which is in the Dumfries and Galloway region. And in this interview, he's being interviewed by Mark Mulhern, who is the lead researcher on this project. And Mark asks Robert how he feels about interviewing his neighbours and his friends about their life stories and how they see themselves situated in the world and how they understand cultural change in the region and the neighbourhood and communities around them. And he says just how remarkable it is how people can reflect on their own lives and their own experiences and can see that affected and impacted by the social change going on around them. And he says how remarkable are these changes from 5 years to 10 years to 20 years. All of that, it's like a rich tapestry, like a tartan rather than a plain cloth. And I thought that was such a useful metaphor for actually what we do in digital preservation as well. So we are really bringing in all of these layers. We're creating this tartan of digital collections of life stories, of research data, and our best bet for understanding what we can do now to ensure that these things persist in the future is to understand Robert and to understand the life stories of his neighbours and of the people that he interviews, and to work really closely with our stakeholder communities and to understand why these collections are so important. And sorry, I didn't read that in dialect. I'm just not even going to do Robert the disservice. But you can find this interview as well as hundreds and hundreds of other interviews on the RESP website. I thought I had included the link on this slide, but it'll be in the credits for the paper. So the Regional Ethnology of Scotland project commenced around 2013 and is managed by the European Ethnological Research Centre, which is an independent research centre but based at the University of Edinburgh. And their entire aim and purpose is to create primary sources to illustrate everyday life in society in Scotland, and they really let these interviews develop organically. They let volunteer field workers really interview the people that they see as key in their communities. And they're undertaking this through a series of regional studies. So far they've done Dumfries and Galloway, south of here, and East Lothian, which is east of here, and that one is still ongoing. Like I said, all the interviews are carried out for the most part by local volunteers who are trained up into how to do oral history recordings and carry out interviews. These numbers are slightly outdated. We have nearly 2,000 individual recordings, plus transcriptions for all of those recordings, images, and documents. And at the moment, the project is funded until next June, but it's likely that that funding will be continued through for another 5 years. So the heritage collections at the University of Edinburgh are the custodians of this archive. So just a little bit of context about who those custodians are, who we are looking after all these recordings. So the university heritage collections have materials dating back to the university's founding in 1582. They don't let me touch and interact with those very often, but I have seen them. I know that they're there. And these collections and heritage collections include rare books, archives and manuscripts, artworks, musical instruments, lots of other types of museum artifacts, from geological specimens to anatomical models. So in total, we have about 60 kilometers of physical holdings, and these are over about 45 sites that include spaces for teaching, for research, and for wider consultation by the public. So in 2018, we ran a pilot study to implement a semi-automated Archivematica implementation. So I'm not going to take you through every detail of this graphic. I meant to ask beforehand if there's a pointer. You'll just have to do with my description. So essentially the automation in our Archivematica instance, which was built by Hrafn Malmquist, he's actually moved on now, doing other adventures in digital preservation. But the automation is that once our content with a metadata file goes into Archivematica, Archivematica will then create our apes and send one copy of our ape to tape storage and one copy to DSpace. Our tapes are actually duplicated, so we have 2 preservation copies on tape, 1 on disk. and also will automatically send our DIP or our access files straight to our archive catalog as a digital object. And we use open source catalog software called ArchiveSpace. So for the RESP project and these sort of hundreds and now thousands of recordings, at the time that that project came in, there's no digital archivist in place. So the developer responsible for building this semi-automated Archivematica pilot was just scripting ad hoc scripts to just push content, prepare content for transfer through this semi-automated Archivematica implementation. So basically just this bit that says Archivematica, that's this whole diagram. So in October 2011, this developer left the university. So with a little bit of a deadline to motivate us, we had to break this semi-programmatic workflow down into steps that we could perform through dashboard, so manually. So you can see here, again, not going to take you through each individual one, but because we had to break this workflow down into lots of tiny pieces, it meant it was much easier to pick up individual tasks and move them upstream. So we now have things like the project archivist, who would have told you previously that she didn't do digital things, actually encoding a metadata file that instructs Archivematica for this automation. So we still do need developer support for maintaining Archivematica, which sometimes occasionally just has a little bit of a bad day, and we don't always know why. But we are then able to start training up and giving specific responsibility for digital preservation to different staff across heritage collections who previously would not have thought that they would be doing digital preservation. So just a few particular things, teething issues with converting a programmatic semi-automated workflow to a manual workflow. One of the big ones is that in order to tell Archivematica where to send these files, we have to also give it this metadata file encoded in JSON. So there is, there are a lot of reasons why it's not ideal to actually create a JSON encoded metadata file by hand. The main one being that you just have one tiny little comma in the wrong place and the whole workflow comes to a halt. But because we broke this workflow down, we could say we just need this one thing. We can take care of the other things. So we did manage to get this web form created by Dave Speed. I am going to name check him. He's sitting right here pretending like he's not here. To build this web form that allowed our archivists and even our ethnologists who are helping with this research project, helping train up our field workers, just be able to input this metadata and have this form create this metadata file for us so we can be more confident that we haven't missed a comma or quotes or something. And this form has worked every time. We have not had a single problem with it, so thank you very much, Dave. So just to show you what that interface looks like, so we, between myself and the other project team members, we curate these interviews, and our preservation unit, our apes, are at this interviewee level, which is what you're looking at here. We process these through Archivematica. This is not actually our instance of Archivematica. This is from the artifactual documentation, but they have very handily labeled all of the different functions just to sort of show what that looks like. And then the very end result is a user interface that pulls the metadata from our catalog and the files from our DSpace repository to create this more intuitive user interface that even the user communities represented in this collection or interviewed can see themselves in this collection and share it with their communities. So now for the interesting parts. It feels a little bit counterintuitive to convert a programmatic workflow into something manual, but we did discover quite a few benefits. So I'd say the sort of best outcome of this was we now have very detailed documentation for our digital preservation systems and procedures and how we use them, because I wanted to be able to give something to our project archivists who felt not super confident using a system like DSpace, for example, so they could go step by step, see exactly what they needed to do. And the other major benefit is that we had less dependence on a developer. So rather than using a developer to actually enact these workflows, we only need a developer when the system doesn't work as expected. So this means more staff who have no previous experience can perform parts of the workflow and also upskill in digital systems and processes. It also means we have more confidence that the metadata descriptive metadata we're including in our DSpace repository mirrors what is being put into the archive catalog, because the archivist who creates the catalog is also inputting that metadata. We also now have much clearer requirements for automation, so we've been really able to narrow down, be like, this thing we're doing it manually, but it really just needs to be done automatically, and we can really articulate that clearly, which means we've got improved communication with our development team. However, there are also still quite a few limitations. So again, there's still a higher risk of human error when you're doing things like encoding metadata documents. There also are longer delays sometimes in fixing issues with Archivematica. This limitation also has an expiration date. We did have budget approved for a full-time permanent digital preservation developer. So if you're interested in working on development, systems development for digital preservation at the University of Edinburgh, applications are open. They close on the 18th of September, so if you're interested, please do come speak to me. But that means we sort of get developers as they're available who might not have used or worked with Archivematica before. And because, again, this will be out of date soon, it also means that we're not able to build new automation and integrate with different systems. So for example, Archive Space is great for archives, but we're also responsible for processing things like born digital artworks. And just sort of obviously, the workflow is more labor intensive, takes a lot longer to do simple steps. But because we don't have this sort of bottleneck waiting for a developer to be available, it does mean we can do things as they become available. So it's more labor intensive, but as it is, we're typically just waiting for interviews to come in. We're all up to date. We don't have a backlog of this material. So some lessons learned, we'd really like to expand that JSON converter to actually be able to create zips, to pull files together and put them into directory structures, to send to digital preservation. We'd also like to explore new access platforms for born digital collections, which I touched on there, things that are appropriate for other types of born digital collections, not just archives. Also, just to really push that need for basic entry-level training in digital preservation for heritage collection staff, so that there are fewer growing pains in starting to distribute parts of these workflows to other collections. I would like to reintroduce some targeted automation, just in places where it's just very time-consuming to do things by hand. I've not gone into this too much. There is a step in the workflow that now that we're doing it manually, that's some unredacted oral history recordings. So about 98% of the recordings are open. There are no data protection issues, but there's a small number that are. There's no way to instruct the automation to suppress those, so we literally just have to wait there and watch it process. And when it is finished processing, have to go in there and suppress it manually in DSpace. So we'd like to maybe explore building some new functionality in the automation. And again, already in the works, applying this workflow to similar collections. So we have actually already started a few new pilot projects, particularly with our Lothian Health Services Archive. So that's the sort of local health board for the non-UK people, the NHS Lothian. The University of Edinburgh is the custodian of those archives as well, and we have started to apply this workflow to some of their materials. So the main lesson of this whole case study is that digital preservation is a shared effort, and overall it is very successful when you can work more closely with people who are at different stages of the life cycle of these digital materials, from the creators all the way through to your repository managers. Thank you very much.
Do we have any questions?
Thank you for that. Lindsay Memory, Brigham Young University. I wondered what types of things that you were now squirreling away your developer time for. What types of projects?
You mean for the new developer we don't have yet, or for the ones that we currently have and just need them sometimes?
Both. Let's hear both.
Oh, okay. I'd say the main support we've gotten up to now is when Archivematica just isn't working, and it's, you know, sometimes to do with our infrastructure and where we have Archivematica running, and we had a problem with Clam AV, just kept having a fit and just causing the entire workflow to fall over, so we just turned it off. Other issues, so Dave built this web form for us so that we didn't have to write JSON by hand. So Pat, who's also here, has been building some integrations with Archivematica to get preserved content from DSpace to feed into interfaces. I'm sure he'd be happy to talk more about that. Oh man, he's giving me daggers. But I think the bigger challenge is trying to scope what we're going to get this new developer to do. I think we've already got about 10 years of work ready for this person when they start. But as I said, we did kind of get our Archivematica instance. It was built around a pilot study, and there wasn't a digital archivist in place, so it wasn't really used. So there are just still a few bits and pieces that need refined, where we feel like it's really in production. And that was the first order of business, yeah.
Thanks.
Any other Archivematica users? I've seen a few shy hands. Just curious.
If I can ask a question.
Oh, absolutely, Laura.
So you talked about this process helping you find the requirements for automation, and we use a different system, but I'm thinking there might be shared requirements there. Do you think there's going to be things that can be extrapolated to other people's workflows out of the kind of things you want to automate?
Yeah, so do you mean the suppression of the unredacted files in particular?
Yeah, or creating the SIP, you know, what the steps you need to do to create SIP packages and things like that.
We would be looking to sort of collaboratively work with Artifactual, make any integrations with Archivematica, you know, of course, open source. If other institutions were interested in similar types of functions, even if they're not exactly the same, we'd love to collaborate and try and build something that's useful for more people. Be great.
Right. Thanks.